as the golden fields of Elmridge swayed in the spring wind. No one knew what coiled beneath the tall grass. A silent predator had been watching for days. But so had Kaela, the German shepherd mother who felt every shift in the breeze, who heard what others missed. When her fragile pup wandered into the open and the python finally struck, it wasn't instinct that made her run. It was something far deeper. And in that breathless moment between the coil and the cry, Kaela made a choice that would never be forgotten. Mornings in Elmridge began slowly, like the quiet breath of the earth itself. Wisps of mist clung to the rocky ledges along the hillside, drifting like a white silk scarf someone had dropped in the remnants of a fading dream. On the narrow dirt road leading into town, footprints marked the path. Some human, some from goats, and some deeper, more deliberate, as if a silent creature had passed this way many times before, always choosing the same trail, the same hour. The Rowan family's wooden house stood at the bottom of the slope, backed by a grove of pines and facing a field swaying with pampas grass. When the wind returned, the field never stayed still. The ground itself seemed to rise and fall gently, as if it could breathe. The breeze came from the northern ridge, passed through the tallest trees, and fell softly onto the front porch, making the flower pots placed by Rowan's mother tremble ever so slightly, like a whisper of morning greetings. Rowan sat cross-legged on the steps, a cup of cooled milk in hand, his gaze stretched far into the field. At 10, his eyes had already learned the kind of silence most adults had long forgotten. Not a silence of worry, but of deep listening. Beneath the porch beside him was Kaela. Kaela didn't press up against him like many other dogs might. She kept a respectful distance, close enough to read the boy's reactions, but always poised, ears alert, eyes fixed on the field ahead, as if standing morning watch. Her dark brown coat, streaked with glistening black, shimmered in the sunlight. And though she had seen at least 2 seasons of birthing, her body remained lean and strong, sculpted, it seemed, by the very wilderness she lived in. Kaela wasn't raised on commands. Since coming to this home, she had never known a leash or a shouted order, only the simple duty of keeping the goats away from the garden rows. She understood every motion of Rowan's mother, Eleanor, and every sprint of the boy across the yard. They didn't train each other. They lived together the way trees live beside a stream, growing, flowing quietly, entangled. Inside the house, Eleanor was washing vegetables. The trickle of water blended with the soft pounding of a stone mortar under the stove, where she often crushed herbs for medicine. She was not yet 40, but her voice carried a low warmth, and her gaze held a depth that made strangers guess otherwise. Once a nurse in the larger town to the south, she had left it all behind after a quiet tragedy no one ever discussed. Since returning to her parents' old cabin, she had planted more flowers, raised chickens, and adopted Kaela from a rescue shelter 60 miles outside Elmridge. To Rowan, Kaela's story wasn't strange. He never asked about the scar on her hind leg, nor why her breathing sometimes sounded heavy at night, as if something old and stuck still lingered in her chest. He only knew that each evening, once the goats were herded in, Kaela was always the last to return, circling the house, inspecting each garden corner, and only then settling onto the wooden floor to rest. Each morning they rose like wild things called by the sun. Not rushed, but never sluggish. Rowan would run along the stream behind the house, where smooth stones shimmered under water as clear as glass. Kaela followed her steps soft, her gaze never drifting from the boy's silhouette. There was no nearby school in this part of the hills. Rowan learned at home, his books delivered on weekends by a traveling vendor. But his truest lessons came from elsewhere, from the deer tracks pressed into damp earth at dawn, from the distant hoot of an owl beyond the pine trees, from the way Kaela raised her head when the wind changed. In this place, everything spoke, even without words. One midday, as Rowan and his mother shared lunch under the porch, the wind shifted. Kaela shivered. barely but enough for Rowan to set his chopsticks down. She stood turned toward the forest and inhaled slowly through her nose. "Winds coming from behind the hill," Eleanor murmured. "Smells different." Rowan didn't yet understand, only noticed that Kaela's eyes didn't stray from the treetops. But after a while, she lay back down and rested her head on the boy's leg, as if the alert had faded into the calm once more. Days passed like that, peaceful days that Rowan would one day remember with just 2 words before everything. Before he knew what it meant to survive. Before he saw a living creature bleed for something it could never explain. Before he learned that sometimes life doesn't need a signal, only a leap through the headwind. As dusk fell, the field out front rustled softly like breath exhaled from the land itself. Kaela walked to the edge of the porch and tilted her ears toward the shifting breeze. Behind her, deep in the trees, something had moved. The first seasonal rain came on a still evening. No thunder, no lightning. Just the gentle sound of droplets on the thin tin roof, like a long-awaited conversation between sky and earth. The lamp on the kitchen shelf cast a golden glow, its light reaching the space beneath the table, where Kaela lay panting heavily. Rowan sat curled at the side of the bed, eyes fixed on the folded blanket prepared earlier that afternoon. He had readied everything: soft rags, a bowl of warm water, diluted milk, and 2 small hands already trembling from anticipation. Eleanor said nothing. She simply placed her hand on his shoulder and pressed gently, as if to acknowledge that this was a moment meant for him to witness. Kaela whimpered, her body arching, with each wave her belly convulsing. Though she had never given birth in this home before, she didn't seem unsure. Her gaze remained on the boy, not frantic, just seeking the quiet reassurance of someone willing to stay through every breath of pain. The first puppy arrived, tiny, soaked, trembling with a bluish tint. Kaela licked it clean, pulled it close against her belly. Then came the second, and the third. Each time a new contraction struck, she paused, braced, then climbed her way through the effort with strained breaths, like a lone traveler pushing uphill. Rowan counted silently, 6 in total, each one small, but one stood apart. The runt. It lay slightly away from the others, unable to open its eyes, its fur pale gray, its chest barely rising, its head bobbing like a leaf in the rain. The boy leaned in and gently wiped the puppy's back with a warm cloth. "Flinn," he whispered, as though naming a friend who had just arrived into the world on the breeze. The name came to him suddenly, without thought, but when spoken aloud, it felt as if it had always belonged. As if this little pup had carried it long before taking form. Kaela looked at the boy, then at Flinn. She didn't growl. She didn't resist. She simply shifted her back leg and nudged Flinn gently closer to the nest. Her quiet way of saying, "I heard you. And I agree." In the days that followed, the rain began to ease and the sun returned. The field in front of the house turned so vividly green it almost glowed beneath the clear sky. The puppies grew quickly. Their eyes began to open, their legs wobbled with first steps. They moved like little stones, learning how to shift, rolling over each other, before nestling into their mother's side to sleep. Flinn remained frail. He often lay near the edge of the nest, slept more, nursed less. But whenever Rowan entered the room, he never reached for any of the others. His hand always went to Flinn first, gently stroking from the pup's crown down its narrow back, lifting it as if holding a blade of pampas grass, too delicate to bloom just yet. Kaela watched it all, silently. She seemed to understand every small movement between the woman's son and her youngest pup. When Flinn was buried under his siblings, she would nudge him free with her paw. When he struggled to feed, she lay fully on her side, shifting her body just enough to bring him closer. It wasn't favoritism. It was balance, quiet, and instinctive. One morning, Rowan brought Flinn out onto the porch and cradled him in his lap. Sunlight poured through the trees, scattering golden dots across the ground. Flinn yawned, his tiny mouth parting to reveal a damp, trembling tongue. Kaela stepped over, not lying down this time, but standing beside the boy, her eyes fixed not on her pup, but on the far field, where birds called out in a slow, steady rhythm that felt like the pulse of the earth itself. "Do you think he'll get stronger?" Rowan asked softly. From inside the house, Eleanor looked up from a bowl of rice. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she watched Kaela's expression, saw the way Flynn's weak tail still gave a half-hearted wag, and said, "He was chosen." Rowan blinked. "By who?" "By Kaela. And by you." From that day forward, every morning in the boy's memory would carry two things: the soft sound of Kaela's paws against the wooden floor and Flynn's quiet gaze. Still tired, still tender, looking up at the first person he saw each day. An Elmridge spring came with fresh pine buds and the earthy scent of rain-soaked soil. But in that small wooden house, the true season began when 6 tiny lives took their first breaths. Among those newborn sparks, one glowed faintly, not yet bright. But it was kept warm by 2 hearts, one that spoke and one that never needed to. Roughly 300 steps from Rowan's home, along a dirt trail lined with wind-tilted trees, stood the cabin of Mr. Hector, the last man the locals called a woodsman. His house sat beneath the shade of an old chestnut tree, its moss-covered roof and weathered wooden walls aged by years of rain and sun. And yet the place was always clean, peaceful, with a faint scent of dried tobacco mixed with pine resin. Rowan was often allowed to visit whenever he finished his lessons early. He loved listening to Mr. Hector's stories. The man had once worked nearly 4 decades as a forest ranger, knew every northern trail, every claw mark, every secret that didn't exist on maps. That day, under soft sunlight, Rowan brought Flinn, still groggy from a mild fever, over for a visit. Kaela followed, keeping her usual pace. Not pressed close, but never far, her eyes scanning each patch of grass, ears alert to every subtle sound. Mr. Hector sat in an old wooden chair mending a rusted trap net. His short-sleeved shirt revealed faded scars along his arms. He squinted at the approaching figure of Kaela. "New mother?" he asked, his voice deep like the roots of trees. "Yes, sir. 6 pups. "This is Flinn," Rowan replied, lifting the small bundle in his arms. Flinn whimpered softly, then burrowed his head into the boy's chest. Mr. Hector nodded, short snout, ears still drooping, but sharp eyes. "This one's a fighter." Rowan sat on a wooden beam nearby. Kaela rested behind him, head atop her front paws, eyes fixed on the forest. As always, quietly prepared. "Have you ever seen a rock python?" Rowan asked, the question escaping before he even knew where it came from. Mr. Hector looked up. The question stopped his hands. "I have," he said slowly. "Twice." The air thickened. The chestnut leaves rustled in the breeze, but inside Rowan's chest, the stillness was taut like a drum skin. "The first time was east of White Marsh," Hector began. "A family raised sheep there. A 5-meter python slithered into their pen at night. By the time I arrived, it had swallowed nearly 1 whole. I could still see the sheep's neck sticking out of its mouth." Rowan tightened his grip around Flinn. "And the second time?" he asked. "That was more recent, maybe 8 years ago. A boy lost his puppy in the woods. Thought it had just wandered off, but we found blood traces and a round depression in the soil. A python's resting spot after a full meal." He paused, eyes no longer on Rowan, but staring past him toward the distant tree line, where the horizon seemed to dip slightly. "Rock pythons are rare in this region," Hector said, voice low but not gone. "They follow dry creek beds, hiding under fallen leaves where no one looks. They don't hunt recklessly, but once they choose, it's silent, patient, and deadly accurate." Rowan swallowed hard. In his mind, the image of Flynn's newborn siblings, eyes closed, legs trembling. suddenly felt far more fragile. "Is there any way to stop them?" he asked. "Yes," Hector replied. "Clear the tall grass near the house. Build tight fencing that hugs the ground. And above all, trust your dog's instincts. They sense death long before we ever do." Kaela shifted slightly, her gaze steady on the old man, as if she understood every word. Rowan reached back and touched her back, feeling her steady breath, rhythmic but not fully relaxed. "My ma and I put up a fence," Rowan murmured. "But we're close to the woods. I'm still scared." Mr. Hector's tone softened. "Fear is good. It keeps you ready. Just don't let fear stop you from listening." On the cabin wall hung an old photo. It showed a young Hector standing beside a German shepherd, much like Kaela. The same proud posture, the same dark coat. Below it read Rico, the one who guarded the forest's sleep. Rowan said nothing for a long while. He didn't ask more questions. But something had begun to click inside him. Kaela Flinn. The woods, the strange wind and stories, the breeze hadn't quite carried away. On the way home, he bowed to Mr. Hector, then matched his steps to Kaela's careful pace. Tucked into the folds of his jacket, Flynn slept soundly. Rowan whispered into Kaela's ear, "If one day the forest stirs, you'll wake me, won't you?" Kaela said nothing. But her steps slowed, and her ears tilted toward the pine ridge, listening for a sound the wind hadn't yet brought. As the dry season began to warm, the patches of soil beneath the rows of green mustard, the puppies grew steadily cradled in Time's unhurried arms. Their eyes were open now, their ears sharp enough to pick up the morning clinks from the goat pen and the soft calls Rowan made each evening, just as the sun dipped behind the hills. Among the six, Flynn remained the smallest, but he had learned to cling to his mother's legs, to whimper for attention, and even at times to attempt leaping out of the nest, though his legs still trembled like freshly tuned strings not yet stable. That morning, sunlight blanketed the backyard in a golden calm. Kaela lay on her side beneath the porch, her eyes half closed but her ears twitching to every subtle sound. The pups lay curled against her belly, except for Flynn, who had wandered farthest. It wasn't mischief that pulled him away, but something that called to him from the edge of the garden. A yellow butterfly fluttered just above his head. Flynn wobbled to his feet, toppled, then tried again, his tiny paws trailing through the grass as though marking his very first path in the world. Kaela rose at once. She didn't bark, she didn't lunge. She simply stepped forward, gently grasped the scruff of her pup's neck, and began pulling him back. But this time Flynn resisted, just slightly, with all the strength he'd only just found. His little tail wagged, his front paws pressed into the ground, clinging to that fragile distance he had claimed from the nest. Rowan sat nearby, his eyes following every detail. The crawling Kaela's swift response, the silence filled with certainty. And in that moment he thought maybe it was time for Flynn to know a world beyond the scent of milk. Later, while Kaela rested, and the other pups slept tangled like a pile of soft fur, Rowan carefully lifted Flynn from the nest. He cupped his hands to shield the pup's head from the sun and walked around to the back garden, where mustard greens had grown to his knees and mint bushes filled the air with a cool scent. Flynn didn't seem afraid. He lifted his head, sniffed at the air, then buried into Rowan's chest, searching for warmth among unfamiliar smells. The boy set him down on a patch of soft earth. For the first time, Flynn touched ground outside the shelter of the porch. He lifted a paw, cautious, and began walking. Tiny steps, as if each blade of grass needed to be understood. Rowan smiled, crouching low with his arms open wide, forming a circle of invisible safety. Flynn made his way forward, stumbling over dry leaves and tiny roots. Yet each time he fell, he pushed himself back up. Sunlight danced along his pale gray fur, catching hints of silver in the fine strands. Light that seemed to carry a promise in every shimmer. "Well done," Rowan whispered, brushing his fingers gently down the pup's neck. "One day you'll run across all the fields." Then came a sound, a soft clicking just behind the fence. Something slithering through the underbrush. Rowan turned quickly, his heart pausing for a beat. But it was only a lizard darting away and vanishing beneath a mint bush. He exhaled and turned back, only to find Kaela already there. She hadn't rushed in or made a scene, but the way she stood between Flinn and the fence, head tilted, eyes stern, made Rowan feel as though he'd just been caught. Kaela stepped forward, licked Flynn's head once, then gently picked him up by the neck. "I just wanted him to try walking," Rowan stammered. Kaela didn't look at him. She turned and carried Flinn back toward the house, her gait calm but firm, a silent reminder spoken with her steps alone. Rowan watched her go, his hand still frozen mid-air. In that moment, he understood to Kaela each of Flynn's steps wasn't merely about growing up. It was a line drawn carefully between life and danger. That night, Rowan quietly placed a small cloth near the pup's nest. Flinn crawled to it, curled into its folds, and nestled in. Kaela lay beside him, and for the first time, she didn't pull her pup back. Rowan didn't apologize. But the way he sat beside them in silence, his hand resting near Kaela's paw, said everything he needed to say. Outside, the wind moved through the wooden slats of the house. Leaves rustled faintly in the distant forest. Flinn slept deeply, his legs twitching, perhaps chasing dreams of steps not yet finished across golden fields that waited beyond his reach. Elmridge was entering the hottest days of the season. Harsh sunlight stretched from morning to dusk, drying the earth until the stones around the house cracked like weathered skin. Heat rolled back from the forest edges, wilting the last rows of mustard greens. And yet, even in the swelter, a breeze still whispered. Thin, subtle threading through every leaf, carrying the scent of dry soil, burnt pine, and something else. Something warmer, unfamiliar. Kaela sensed it first. That morning, as usual, she lay near the chicken coop, where shade blanketed the ground and the pups could play within sight. But instead of dozing, her ears flicked sharply, nose pressed low, then lifted to inhale deeply. Her eyes locked onto the dense grass near the fence line, where the light barely reached and the growth stood as tall as a grown man's waist. Kaela moved forward without a sound. She didn't bark. She didn't growl. Only a low rumble emerged from deep in her throat, a soft, steady warning. Her tail rose, her back legs coiled like a spring. Her nose swept over the flattened path, where grass had been pushed down in a long, winding line. Rowan, busy filling the water trough for the goats, caught sight of Kaela frozen in the field. The sunlight glinted off her coat, giving her the glow of golden dust. He assumed she was stalking a mouse or a wild rabbit. "Kaela, come back." "It's too hot out," he called gently. She didn't move. She stood there as still as stone. And then suddenly she turned and ran. Not toward him, but toward the shaded coop where Flinn and his siblings slept beneath the tree. Kaela checked each pup one by one. She touched their heads with her snout, sniffed every inch of their fur, then laid herself down among them like a wall of flesh and fur. A shield. Rowan stared, puzzled. He'd never seen her this tense. Still, he shrugged it off. Maybe the heat had made her irritable. By noon, the strange scent had vanished. The breeze shifted. The forest fell silent. But Kaela never left her place. She remained facing the tall grass, her eyes unblinking. That evening, as Eleanor stepped out back to collect the laundry, she heard a faint scraping near the base of the fence. But dusk had already begun to settle, and she assumed it was just a rat, or perhaps a wild weasel passing through. She gathered the clothes, turned back toward the house, and left behind a stretch of shadow that was slowly thickening. And within that darkness, something long and silent began to move. The rock python had arrived. It had hidden in the tall grass for 3 consecutive nights, watching in stillness every movement around the whelping pen. Its body stretched over 3 meters, its back mottled with deep brown glints, every scale gliding across the soil without a single sound. Each night, it crept a little closer, then retreated at dawn. But tonight, the wind had shifted. It picked up the scent of colostrum, of tender fur, of fragile breath from lives not yet fully formed. An easy meal, a safe one. If the guardian at the gate was weary or distracted, Kaela was neither. As night cloaked the rooftop in shadows, she remained upright, not lying down, sitting. Her ears angled toward a single point in the grass, where a faint rustle had just stirred as if a fingertip had touched the surface of water and vanished. She growled low, this time more clearly. Rowan was seated nearby, reading on the porch. He looked up and called to her, "Kaela," but she didn't turn. A few moments passed. Perhaps to ease his own worry, Rowan got up and walked over to the pen. He checked the puppies. They were fast asleep. Flinn curled up against the cloth he had placed days before. Rowan stroked their heads, then turned to Kaela and smiled softly. "It's nothing. Go to sleep." She only stared at him, her eyes fixed. Then the evening wind returned, but not carrying the scent of pine or warm dust. It brought with it something sharper, heavier, a scent like heat rising from stone buried deep in the earth. Kaela lowered her head and tapped her paw against the ground 3 times. It was an old signal used only when she needed to awaken instinct in the pack. The pups still slept. Rowan went back inside. And in the darkness, the python slithered closer, inch by inch, breath by breath. Through the tall grass, past the fence, slipping through the smallest gap left by human hands. On the dry soil, its passage left a trail like an invisible signature. Kaela rose. Her breath slowed. Muscles rippled beneath her coat, every fiber tense. This time her eyes no longer gazed at the vague unknown. They locked straight onto death as it crept forward from beneath the brush. The next morning, Elmridge shifted. From dawn, gusts of wind began tearing in from the west, howling through the valley, slamming into the old wooden fence. Eucalyptus leaves scattered across the backyard, clinging to coop doors and flowering mustard stalks. The tin roof trembled beneath the gusts, drumming chaotically like a war drum in broken rhythm. Eleanor frowned at the sky. The gray clouds weren't thick, but they moved fast, skimming just above the treetops. "Rain's coming," she said, part statement, part warning. "Let's check the fence," Rowan replied, buttoning his collar and grabbing a bucket of nails. The backyard descended into a frenzy. A sheet of tin from the goat shed had torn loose, flipping over the roof and sending the chickens scattering. Eleanor circled the coop with a hammer in hand, holding down her cloth hat as it flapped in the wind. Rowan hammered loose boards into place occasionally, crouching to untangle straw from his boots. Both were busy. Neither looked toward the whelping pen as they usually did. Kaela, however, remained at her post, right at the threshold of the pup's den. But something in her gaze had changed. Her ears twitched constantly, sometimes drooping, then perking again. Each time the wind changed direction, she rose and circled the pen nose pressed to the ground, as if trying to recover a scent buried beneath the dust. Inside, 5 puppies huddled together, curled tight to avoid the chill rising from the wooden floor. But Flinn, like always, pushed toward the light. He had begun walking on his own, though his steps were still unsure. He was the first to lift his head at the sound of Rowan's boots, the only one who crawled to the nest's edge to seek his mother's warmth, even while his siblings slept. A gust tore the cloth lining the nest loose. Flinn wriggled out, slipping free from the tangled fur, and began crawling toward the beam of golden light cutting through the coop door, toward a place he had never touched before. Kaela, watching from afar, saw it. She stood immediately. But the wind roared too loud. She howled, sharp, deep pulsing, a sound born from pure instinct. But the cry vanished into the wind, swallowed by the banging tin, the hammering of nails, and Eleanor's voice calling from the goat pen, Rowan. "Come hold this post!" Kaela turned and ran. But Flinn had already crossed the threshold. The little one stumbled onto the short grass, where mustard leaves tangled around his feet like soft roots. The wind made his fur bristle, dust made him squint. Still Flinn crawled forward, drawn by the dancing light reflected from a shallow puddle left by last night's rain, glimmering beneath the midday sun. Kaela charged after him, but between her and Flinn stretched a strip of exposed earth. And right in the middle, beneath the trembling layer of fallen leaves, was a long, winding trace. The python had moved closer than ever before. It had chosen the day of wind, the moment when human focus drifted, to strike. Its body flattened against the ground, each scale brushing dry roots, its eyes fixed on the small, unsteady figure, moving blindly across sunlit space. Flinn didn't know. He kept walking, curious about the mix of dry soil and mint that filled his nose. Kaela was almost there, only a few steps away. Then it happened. A sheet of tin torn loose from the goat shed flew overhead and crashed down right beside her. A metallic thud. Dust exploded. Kaela flinched, half a second. Just enough for Flinn to take 2 more steps. Eleanor screamed. Rowan turned and saw the dog frozen jaws parted, eyes locked on something in the grass. But Flinn, small as he was, had vanished beneath the glare of noon and a tangle of leaves. Rowan moved to run, but Eleanor grabbed his arm. "The wind's too strong." "Don't go there, Flinn," Rowan cried, pointing to a flicker of gray fur barely visible in the distance. And at that moment, something stirred. From beyond the thick underbrush, the python emerged, its body unfolding like a blade slicing across the earth. Kaela's eyes twitched. She lowered her body, released a growl, this time deeper, harsher. The wind couldn't carry it away anymore. Rowan heard it. Eleanor heard it. But it was already too late. The python struck forward, and Flinn, still mesmerized by the glimmering puddle, had no idea that this morning's wind had been the prelude to a real nightmare. The howl rang out, not merely a sound, but a jolt that tore through the chest like a wire pulled tight around every last thread of awareness left in the storm. Rowan snapped his head toward it. That sound wasn't like any of Kaela's howls he'd ever known. It wasn't a rallying call, nor the alert she gave when wild animals wandered into the garden. It was something deeper, drier, torn from the back of the throat, more like a scream held in by desperation. It ripped through the wind, through the air, through the fragile boundary between fading peace and rising terror. He didn't stop to understand. His legs just moved. "Rowan, stop!" Eleanor shouted behind him, but only the wind answered. Rowan sprinted across the backfield, scanning. Rows of mustard, the fence, the puddle, and then froze. No more than 20 steps ahead, time collapsed into a single frozen scene. Flinn, his tiny body, was twisted within the tightening coils of a creature longer than any grown man. The python had wrapped 3 full loops around him, each loop like a tightening band of iron. Its tongue flicked out crimson and wet its eyes like twin polished stones. One end of its body was already locked around Flynn's middle, the muscles thick and unrelenting, pulling tighter with each passing second. Kaela stood right beside it. Her jaws were clamped around the python's tail. Blood seeped from her mouth, but her eyes never left Flinn. "Kaela," Rowan screamed, his heart falling straight into the dirt. In an instant, a wave of images surged through his mind. The trail by the fence days ago, that unheeded growl, and the moment this morning when Kaela had sounded an alarm, no one understood. She had known. She had smelled it before. But no one had listened. The python turned at the sound of running feet. Its head rose slightly, mouth open, tongue snapping in warning. But it didn't release Flinn. The coils squeezed harder. Rowan stopped just a few meters away. His heartbeat roared in his ears. He wanted to scream to charge in, but his feet felt rooted in place. Kaela didn't wait. She lunged again, her jaws closed on the python's midsection, clamping down with savage precision. She bit deep, twisting, yanking, as though trying to sever the beast in two. Blood burst from the wound. The python convulsed, and in that instant, its grip loosened ever so slightly. Flinn let out a tiny cry, barely audible, but it was enough. Rowan jolted out of his trance. He spun and sprinted back toward the house, shouting at the top of his lungs, "Mom! A python!" Eleanor rushed out, just in time to see her son grab the shovel leaning near the coop door. She couldn't speak. She only saw his eyes, full of tears, burning with something she had never seen in him before. Rowan turned back, gripping the shovel, trampling through dry grass with pounding feet. Kaela was still fighting. She hadn't backed down. Blood soaked her neck, her back, her hind legs. But every bite, every pull landed where it needed to. The python hissed, a chilling metallic sound, and lashed out, twisting violently. Kaela was thrown off her body, rolling several times across the ground. But she rose immediately, and her eyes, now aflame with more than instinct, blazed with an unspoken vow. Rowan reached them. He swung the shovel. "Let him go," he roared, as if fire had erupted from his chest. The blade struck the python's body, slicing deep. It recoiled, hissed again, this time with a hint of fear. Eleanor joined him, wielding a long wooden pole, usually used to keep the chickens out of the garden. She didn't hesitate. Her first strike landed squarely across the same spot Kaela had torn open. The python reeled. The pressure in its coils slackened. And at that exact moment, Kaela surged forward, not to bite, but to throw her entire body into the python's wrapped loops. The coil faltered. Flinn slipped out, like a breath breaking free from a tangled net of nightmares. Rowan dove in, scooping the pup into his arms. He held Flinn tightly against his chest, feeling the tiny body tremble, the breath shallow, but still there. Eleanor kept swinging. Rowan stepped back. Kaela stood in front of them, shoulders braced, ready for any final strike. The python coiled once more, but this time it didn't attack. It turned, then slithered rapidly toward the forest, leaving behind a trail of blood-torn earth and a home that had stood on the very edge of loss. The sun disappeared behind passing clouds. The wind still blew, but now it carried more than dust and leaves. It carried the scent of blood, of disturbed soil, and of something sacred that had just been preserved. When Flinn raised his head, the light in his eyes reflected the slithering shape that had come for him. There had been no warning, no shadow to fall over him in time. Just a sudden flash of movement across the ground, cold fast like lightning on the earth, striking. And then everything shattered. The python's bite hadn't drawn blood. It hadn't needed to. Its slick jaws had snapped down on Flynn's back, and in a blink its body had coiled, dragging the tiny pup off the ground in an instant. One loop, then two, then three. Each one cinched tighter like living steel ropes. No sound emerged, only a thin, cold hiss. The sound of air rushing through a hollow pipe that made the earth feel frozen beneath Kaela's paws. She saw it all. And just as the third coil locked in place, Kaela leapt. One jump. No hesitation, no calculation. She hurled herself from the porch like a living spear. Her paws struck the ground once, then launched again, her jaws wide open, aimed straight for the python's middle. Her teeth hit hard scales. A rush of iron filled her nose. Damp earth blood and the foreign scent of something that didn't belong to this place. Kaela growled. Not a signal anymore, but a command. She bit down with everything she had, shook her head violently, as if to rip the intruder apart. The python didn't retreat. It tightened one last time. Flinn still hadn't drawn breath. His eyes barely opened, his entire body trembling beneath the crushing coils that pressed down on every rib. The soft cracking sounds, like dry twigs being gently twisted, echoed through the silence. But Flynn's gaze in that moment remained fixed on Kaela. Kaela saw it. That tiny flickering gaze had never left her. She growled again. Her teeth slipped against the snake's armored hide, blood spilling from the corner of her mouth. But she didn't stop. This time she used everything she had, biting, clawing, ramming her body into the serpent as if she could tear apart the deadly coils with flesh alone. The python reacted. It released its hold on Flynn's upper body, hissed and turned, its gaping jaws aimed at Kaela. She dodged. Its teeth caught only a tuft of her shoulder fur. It hurt, but didn't stop her. She twisted her body and lunged again, sinking her teeth into the python's neck. The first clean bite. Blood touched her tongue. At the edge of the yard, Rowan was sprinting forward, shovel in hand, but still too far. Kaela didn't wait for help. The pups in the pen had gone quiet. They sensed something happening, something beyond their young comprehension. Eleanor was farther away, but the moment she heard the first howl, she had understood. The python hissed again, this time in pain. It whipped its body, throwing Kaela back, but she didn't tumble far. Her head slammed into the earth, but she stood immediately, as if momentum didn't apply to her. Blood soaked the fur around her neck. Her eyes burned a shade of gold-orange. No longer the eyes of a dog, but of a mother. The coils loosened for a split second. Flynn, like a dry twig falling from a giant's grip, slid to the ground. His body was still warm, but his breath was fading into mist. Kaela saw. She lunged forward. This time she didn't bite. She hurled herself across the python's body, pinning it down with her full weight. She howled, a long, piercing call that cut through the gray sky like a bell tolling inside a storm. Rowan saw it, and everything around him seemed to slow. The mother dog, bleeding red-stained, her teeth locked into the enemy, was fighting not for herself, but to keep one fragile breath from being lost. And Flynn, lying motionless in the grass, his eyes fluttering, one leg twitching, chest barely rising. Rowan screamed. He heard nothing but the wind and the pounding in his ears. He had seen the first coil, and he knew, if they didn't act now, it would become the last. The python's body, thick as stone, reared in the backyard. The wound on its neck from Kaela's bite had torn through its scales. Blood streaked dark red under the overcast sky. But instead of fleeing, it tightened its grip. Not around Flynn, but around Kaela. Kaela roared. The serpent's coils wrapped from her back to her belly, her hind legs suspended, unable to brace. The snake's cold scales slid across her chest and stomach like chains. Blood dripped from her mouth to her chest. But her jaws never released. Her teeth had sunk into the python's neck muscle, just behind the base where the thick scales didn't fully shield. She bit harder, twisting, jerking, fighting death with the cords of her own neck. The python convulsed. Its body shook. Its hiss screeched between clenched fangs, like thunder trapped inside the earth. Blood sprayed across Kaela's face, but her eyes never strayed from Flynn. Rowan arrived. sweat pouring down, shovel clenched. He saw the python shift its coils. "Mom!" he screamed, voice cracking with panic. Eleanor ran from the coop, gripping the long wooden pole they used to shoe the chickens. She ran with the urgency only a mother knows. The kind that comes not from fear, but from knowing what finality looks like. Rowan dropped to his knees beside Kaela. He tried to wedge the shovel between the coils, but his hands were trembling too much to find the right angle. I can't do it." His voice collapsed. Eleanor said nothing. She placed a firm hand on his shoulder, her eyes fixed like arrows on the python, crushing their companion. Blood from Kaela's mouth dripped onto the soil. Bright, shining red, catching the slivers of sunlight, breaking through a torn sky. Flinn lay only feet away, still breathing, but fading. Rowan cried out. He turned and swung the shovel downward, slamming it into the python's middle. A shriek sliced the wind. The serpent recoiled from Kaela slightly, but its coils turned toward Rowan. "Back up," Eleanor shouted. Rowan stumbled upright, but his eyes were locked on Kaela. Her body sagged back, arched mouth no longer clenching. He couldn't wait. He dove forward, grabbed her body, and pulled with everything he had. Her claws scraped the ground, carving ragged tracks through a mix of blood and dirt. Her limbs had gone limp, but her eyes, still open, still fixed on Flinn. "She's still awake," Rowan yelled, as if clinging to the last thread of hope. Eleanor moved behind the python and struck hard, right across its raised head. Blow after blow, as if breaking a curse. The python writhed, recoiling. The grip weakened. Rowan dragged Kaela halfway out. He raised the shovel again, striking the tail, once, then again. The wind roared around them. The smell of blood, of metal, of torn earth, all fused into a single moment where life, death, and instinct became crystal clear. Kaela growled, a low, shaky sound, but it rang like a bell inside the storm. She was still alive. Rowan fell to his knees, cradling her head, hands trembling but dry-eyed. Eleanor stood guard in front of them, pole raised. One last barrier between the serpent and the sacred thing they had nearly lost. The python slowly backed away. It was wounded, clearly. Blood dripped from each wound. Its tongue flicked out, trembling, then withdrew as it turned toward the forest, vanishing into the shadowed underbrush that swallowed its cruelty whole. The wind calmed. The air still trembled. But what mattered was this: Flinn still breathed. Kaela still watched. And those trails of blood, they weren't just pain. They were proof of an unspoken war. Rowan gently stroked Kaela's ear. His voice cracked into a whisper. "You protected us. Now it's our turn to keep you." Kaela didn't reply, but her ear twitched, just slightly. And Rowan knew. She had heard. From the narrow dirt road behind the chestnut grove, a lone figure slowly emerged, half-veiled by evening mist and the soft rustle of wind through the trees. He wore a worn brown coat, carried a leather weapon case in one hand, and a faded canvas bag over one shoulder. His steps were heavy, but his eyes remained sharp as ever. Rowan looked up first. When he recognized the familiar outline, he called out, "Mr. Hector." The man paused, his eyes sweeping across the scene. Rowan kneeling beside Kaela, her bloodied body still breathing with difficulty, eyes open and glazed with pain. Not far off, Flinn lay curled up, trembling, his small body shivering between the lingering chill of dusk and exhaustion from the battle with death. And Eleanor stood firmly between them, a wooden staff in hand, her face a portrait of worry, tempered by a readiness to protect no matter the cost. Hector stepped closer, stopping when he saw the long blood trail leading from the back porch to the edge of the forest. The grass was crushed in broad swaths. On the soil, long curving impressions still marked the python's retreat. "How many minutes?" he asked, without taking his eyes off the tracks. I don't know. Maybe 10? Rowan's voice wavered. Hector nodded faintly. He lowered his bag, unsnapped the leather case from his shoulder, and pulled out an old but well-maintained tranquilizer gun. From the canvas bag, he took out a few vials of solution, a specialized syringe kit, and a folded forest map, meticulously marked with red ink. "You were right," he said quietly, after a moment of studying the terrain. "It's an adult python. Judging from the length, the crushing force, and the attack method, I'd say it's at least 3.5 meters. Eleanor frowned. "How can you be so sure?" Hector knelt, slipping on gloves as he gently examined Kaela's wounds. His voice was slow and steady. "I saw the same bite marks on a deer out west 5 years ago. Back when I was still in the Ranger Corps, we managed to trap that one. But not long after the northern woods were scorched, the food chain was disrupted and..." He paused, exhaled. "We lost track of the other one. This might be it." Rowan clenched his fists. "So what do we do now? What if it comes back? It's not..." "If," Hector said firmly, his eyes locking with the boys. "It's when. It's already marked the scent, and once a predator like that has chosen its prey, it will return." He loaded a tranquilizer round into the chamber. "I don't want to kill it, not if I can help it. Snakes, pythons, they act on instinct. The problem is this isn't deep forest anymore. This is where you live. This is your home." Rowan watched him, saying nothing, as Hector prepared with the quiet efficiency of a seasoned hunter. But there was no bloodlust in his expression. Only calm understanding, and something that looked a lot like remorse. "You're going into the forest?" Eleanor asked. "Not too deep," he replied. "I'll stake out near the perimeter. If it circles back, I'll have a shot. This tranquilizer won't kill it. Just knocks it out for a few hours. Long enough for us to relocate it far away." "I want to come," Rowan said quickly, grabbing Hector's arm. "No." The man's voice was hard. "You stay here. Watch Kaela. Watch Flinn. I need someone outside who's alert. If I don't come back in 2 hours, contact the ranger station. I've marked the coordinates." He handed Eleanor a small slip of paper scribbled with symbols and numbers. Then he turned back to Kaela, crouched beside her, and placed a calloused hand gently on her blood-matted head. It was a rare gesture from the old ranger. "You did good, Kaela," he said softly. "I've seen animals run at the scent of blood. But you charged toward it. True shepherd blood." Kaela exhaled, her eyes lowering, almost as if she understood. "Take care of her," Hector told Rowan. "And remember, if you see anything move at the tree line, don't shout. Don't run. Watch. Then tell your mother." Rowan nodded, both hands clutching Kaela's fur, holding on as if his grip alone could keep her anchored here. Hector stood. He checked the gun again, slipped 2 more darts into his jacket pocket, and stepped into the tall grass. No one called after him. They just watched him disappear, toward the trees where the last shafts of sunlight pierced through the canopy. And there, on the edge of wilderness and hearth between predator and protector, a man who once walked away from duty returned, stepping back into his place as guardian of the forest, sentinel of the threshold, and the final hope for keeping peace in a home still stained with blood. He crouched low, weaving through the brush without stirring a sound. The tranquilizer gun stayed ready in his hand. Though his hair had grayed, his eyes were keen, reading every flick of leaf, every tremor in the undergrowth, with the reflexes of a hunter who had long ago learned the breathing rhythm of the woods. The wind shifted from the south, carrying the smell of blood of humans, and of the python. He spotted its trail again, clearer now. The winding body had pressed a path straight toward the coop behind Eleanor's house. But this time the track curved, not in a straight line, but looping wide. It was circling. It was returning, smarter now, from the one direction no one would expect. Back at the yard, Rowan had one hand resting on Kaela's neck, the other wrapped protectively around Flinn, now bundled in an old jacket. Despite his weakness, Flinn still stirred when he heard sounds, his eyes fluttering open, as if something in him still needed to see how the story ended. Kaela lay beside him, no longer panting like before. Her body had given all it had. She was soaked in blood, but her head stayed lifted, ears erect, as if called, she would rise again. Then it came. A hiss, familiar now, rose from the thick brush, not violent like a roar, but long and sinuous, gliding through the air with a deadly promise. "Rowan, get inside," Eleanor shouted, grabbing her son. But Kaela had already risen. From the tall grass, the python emerged, massive, thick, rearing up nearly to a man's waist. Its eyes gleamed gold, cold like hardened sap. Its mouth opened wide. Two hooked fangs flashed. Its body coiled, ready to strike. And before anyone could move, Kaela leapt. No bark, no growl, only a streak of gray tearing through the wind. She sank her teeth into the python's head. Dead center. Kaela's entire body trembled from pain, but she held her ground. Her front paws dug deep into the muddy earth claws, anchoring her as her jaws clamped tightly. Her head tilted just enough to lock the serpent's skull in place. The python thrashed. It coiled its massive body, trying to hurl her off like before. But this time it failed. Though blood continued to drip from the corners of her mouth, though her limbs slipped across the slick dirt and her ribs heaved from exhaustion, Kaela bit down harder. Hector burst out from the tree line. His eyes needed only a second to assess. Its head was low-tilted right, not fully exposed, but enough. "Hold that head steady," he shouted. Kaela didn't respond. She only sank her teeth deeper. Her neck muscles tensed, gums bleeding, but her eyes, those burning golden eyes, still glowed like a flickering ember that refused to die. Hector raised the tranquilizer gun, stepped back with his left foot, squared his stance, aligned the sights, and fired. A dry hiss. The dart shot out cleanly, piercing just below the snake's jawline between two slick, overlapping scales. The python shrieked. Its entire body jolted, as if a wire had been yanked through its spine. Its eyes widened, muscles coiled one last time in a violent electric spasm. Kaela was thrown. She flew back nearly 3 strides, her back grazing a tree trunk, before she crashed down beside Flinn. Rowan screamed and rushed forward. Kaela lay still, her breathing shallow and rapid, but her eyes remained open. She looked at Flinn, then at Hector. The python slowed. Its convulsions grew weaker, its movements sluggish, almost disoriented. Within a minute, its massive form sagged into the ground, an unmoving mass of muscle and scales. Hector exhaled long and deep. He lowered the gun and turned to Kaela. "You did good, girl," he whispered. "You held the head of a monster." Rowan knelt beside her, cradling her head, and for the first time tears fell onto her blood-matted fur. "She never let go," he whispered, "even when no one told her to." Eleanor stepped forward, placing a hand on Rowan's shoulder. Her eyes followed the lifeless python stretched across the yard. Long, heavy, once death itself, now just a husk without soul. And in that quiet, heavy stillness, one small life still lay breathing. Flinn. He stirred just slightly, eyelids fluttering as if he could sense the sacrifice that had unfolded around him. The air in Elmridge's backyard felt pressed in thick with more than the scent of blood and mud. It was the weight of time stretched to its breaking point. Though the tranquilizer had struck true, the struggle wasn't over. Everything was still teetering on the knife edge of climax, where every creature, even in exhaustion, fought with the last of its life force. The python, over 3.5 meters long, let out one final shriek. The sound grated like metal sawed against stone. Its final lurch twisted the earth, flinging wild grass smashing into tree trunks, knocking over a water basin. Its head snapped upward, trying to rise. But the slowing had begun. Its eyes grew dull, the golden glint fading behind a murky film like cooling ash. Hector didn't flinch. He knew. After the first tranquilizer shot, time to full effect could vary between 30 and 90 seconds. With large-bodied snakes, muscles dense and crushing, there was always a final window. The last fight before the drug truly claimed them. And just as expected, it hadn't surrendered yet. It flung its tail one final time, this time striking the bushes where Kaela and Flinn lay. Rowan shouted, throwing himself over Flynn's arms, wrapping around the pup's limp frame, yanking him out of the danger zone just in time. "What are you doing?" Eleanor cried, but Rowan didn't stop. He lifted Flinn into his arms, his own body shaking from tension and the fragile weight he now carried. Flinn was barely conscious, his breaths jagged, whispering through his nose, like wind through cracked leaves. But his body was still warm, still here. "I have to get him out of here," Rowan shouted, glancing back at Kaela. She hadn't moved, but her eyes followed every motion her boy made. Gone was the fire of defiance. In its place was a calm certainty, a gaze that said, "Go. I'll hold what's left." Hector caught Rowan's movement, but turned his attention back to the snake. 20 seconds, he called out. The python thrashed again, a last storm of coiling muscles, staggering like a creature caught between reflex and collapse. But its final blow still carried monstrous force. Hector stepped back toward the fence, eyes fixed, unwavering. Eleanor gripped the staff in her hand, planting herself between Rowan and the beast, solid as stone in the face of the storm. Hector narrowed his eyes, gun raised once more. Though the first shot had landed, he wouldn't gamble. If the snake's nerves remained too active, the final seconds could still turn deadly. The second shot fired, fast, sharp, precise. The dart embedded just below the python's belly, where the skin was thinner, the muscles exposed. And just like that, like someone had cut the final thread, its body collapsed. No sound, no twitch, no resistance. It lay there, long, cold, unmoving, as if the soul had slipped out, leaving only the shape behind. Eleanor exhaled the first full breath in what felt like forever. Hector lowered the weapon, his body relaxing until even his knees bent with release. "It's over," he murmured. "But don't go near it for 10 more minutes. Reflexes might still fire." Rowan had already carried Flinn to the porch. He gently laid him on a towel. Eleanor had just spread out his hands, pressing softly over the pup's chest, coaxing each breath as if whispering them back into place. Flinn blinked, slow but real. "Hang on, I'm right here," Rowan murmured, his lips trembling. Kaela, spent and silent, still lifted her head to watch. And the moment she saw Flinn alive, whole, her jaw loosened. It wasn't a smile, it was something quieter. A warrior's release. The signal that the land she had defended was now safe. A soft breeze drifted through the backyard, scattering the scent of blood and soil. The golden light of sunset spilled across the trampled earth, illuminating the silent python and 3 fragile lives breathing as faintly as smoke. In that fleeting moment, Elmridge seemed to hold its warmth, not from the sunlight, but from the quiet belief that this wild and lonely place was still protected by those who needed no summons, yet always arrived when it mattered most. When Rowan laid Flynn onto the soft cotton towel beneath the porch roof, the world seemed to hush. The python had gone still. The ground no longer trembled beneath their feet, and even the wind gentled brushing through his hair like a silent gesture of comfort. But Rowan's heart did not quiet. He turned slowly, walking back to Kaela. She hadn't moved. Still lying in the same battered circle of flattened grass and blood-streaked mud, Kaela had kept her head turned toward Flynn, as if guarding the threshold between life and loss, refusing to step away until she was certain that the gate was safe again. And only then did she let go, her body sinking gently, gracefully, like the final petal falling from a late-season bloom. Her limbs stretched out, her body slumped sideways, and her tail now just a dusty line fading into the soil. If there was breath still left in her, it was barely there. Her chest rose and fell in tiny trembling waves, each one pulled from a depth so distant it seemed beyond the reach of flesh, as though her heart had nearly touched the end of what it could bear. "Kaela," Rowan whispered, kneeling beside her. He placed a trembling hand on her chest, still warm but no longer strong. Dried blood clung to the deep punctures around her ribs, and her dark coat had lost its familiar sheen. But one thing remained untouched, her gaze. Though heavy, her eyes stayed open, focused in one direction, toward Flynn. Rowan felt his heart falter. He turned and understood. Flynn was watching her too, that small body curled like a fresh green sprout after a storm breathed in shallow whispers. He shifted now and then, only slightly, and though his vision remained cloudy, the reflection of Kaela still shimmered in his eyes, as if the thread between mother and child had never been severed. Rowan didn't cry. He didn't speak. He simply pulled the towel closer, inching Flynn toward her, then reached down, lifting Kaela's head, and gently placed it beside the pup. Two bodies, one large, one small, now lay side by side on the earth, one flickering, one slipping into darkness. Eleanor stepped beside them, kneeling down beside her son. In her hands were a bowl of warm water and a clean cloth. She wiped the blood from Kaela's neck, then held the bowl near her mouth. But Kaela didn't move. She lay there, like a silent mountain, her life force now echoing only in memory. "She held our whole family together," Eleanor murmured, "with everything she had." Rowan nodded softly, his eyes damp. "Do you think she knew she wouldn't have strength left?" he asked. Eleanor looked at her son, then back at Kaela's fading, golden eyes. "It wasn't that she knew," she whispered. "It's that she chose. She chose to pour out every last ounce, chose to bear the pain so that something more precious might keep living, chose not to turn away even when her body was beyond its limits." Rowan gently took Flynn's tiny paw and placed it atop Kaela's foreleg. One side soft and warm, the other cold and trembling. Yet between those two skins, there passed something unseen, a rhythm without words, without sound, only existence. Hector approached quietly then. He stood behind Eleanor and Rowan, his eyes falling on the long smear of blood trailing from the snake to Kaela's chest. "She's one of the strongest mothers I've ever seen," he said, voice rough but steady. "She didn't fight because she was afraid. She fought because she loved." Rowan said nothing. He only brushed aside the mud between Kaela's ears and whispered, "You held him here. You didn't let anyone go." A small sound, barely a whimper, rose from Flynn. Not from pain, but from life. His ear twitched. His body shifted again, more deliberate this time. Then his eyes opened fully. They were still weak, but brighter. Flynn lifted his head, leaned forward, and touched his nose to Kaela's neck. It wasn't a lick, not a nuzzle, just a touch. But it was enough. Kaela shivered. Her breath gathered. just once more, as if that single breath was all she had left to give to him. They lay like that, mother and son, beneath a twilight sky where blood and love soaked the same soil indistinguishable. In that fragile balance between survival and loss, sometimes a single gaze is all it takes to keep another heart alive. The sun rose higher, but its warmth couldn't erase what lingered in Elmridge's backyard. The breeze carried the scent of diluted blood and splintered bark. The yard, once quiet now, bore tracks, muddy streaks, and twin wheel marks pressed into the soft ground. The wildlife rescue truck sat just outside the old wooden fence, its engine idling low while voices began to break the hush. 3 officers in olive green uniforms stepped out. One carried a large metal crate with a vented lid, another carefully examined the tranquilizer dart still embedded in the python's neck. Hector offered a brief explanation. There were nods, confirmations. Then they got to work. The python, long, heavy, and slick, was transferred into the crate in silence. No one spoke in blame. No one showed anger, because even that fearsome creature had acted by instinct. This encounter hadn't been a battle of good and evil, but a collision of 2 forces, survival and love. Eleanor stood by the fence, her hands still streaked with dried blood, but her gaze unwavering. She didn't take her eyes off Kaela, who now lay on a makeshift wooden board. Flinn bundled beside her in an old gray towel. Every breath, every twitch was watched with the fragile reverence of something holy, as if any small change could tip the scale either way. "We'll take the python back to the wildlife center," the lead officer said. "Then assess if it can be released into the reserve or needs continued monitoring." Rowan gave a single nod. He didn't ask anything more. He hadn't said a word since they arrived. Hector turned, resting a hand gently on the boy's shoulder. His voice was low. "Now's the time to hold on to what's worth holding, kid." Rowan lowered his head and stepped closer to Kaela. He sat down beside the wooden board, gently placing his hand over her folded ears. This time there was no stroking, no calling her name. He simply kept his hand there, silent and steady, as if that single touch could anchor a weary soul that had nearly drifted too far. "We're going now," Kaela Eleanor said, her voice barely above a whisper, audible only to those standing close. "You need care. And Flinn, he needs his mother's warmth to carry on." A few moments later, Hector's old truck rumbled to life. They spread out soft blankets across the back seat, added layers for warmth, then carefully lifted both Kaela and Flinn into the vehicle. Rowan never let go of Kayla's ear throughout the entire process. He sat next to them, not in the cabin, but in the open truck bed where the wind blew hard against his face and the engine roared beneath his feet. He accepted all of it, just to stay near the mother and pup. Flynn's breathing had steadied, though he remained curled tight. Kaela hadn't stirred, but her ear still tilted slightly toward the boy, as if she could feel the pulse in Rowan's fingers and chose to keep listening to it. The drive from Elmridge to the town veterinary clinic usually took 30 minutes. But to Rowan, it stretched endlessly like a long March evening, heavy with unspoken thoughts. He didn't try to recall the events that had just passed. He only sat there, quiet, unmoving, his hand resting on the same ears he'd grown used to stroking every night before bed. "You're still the Kaela I've always known," he whispered. "But today, you became greater than I ever imagined." Eleanor sat in the passenger's seat, her gaze fixed on the rearview mirror. She saw her son there, his narrow shoulders braced against the wind shielding Kaela from the cold. And she understood. What was growing in Rowan now wasn't just age, but something deeper. Something that could only rise from a place where love and loss walked hand in hand. When the truck pulled up to the clinic's gate, 2 veterinary staff were already waiting outside. They brought out a stretcher, gently lifting Kaela first, then Flinn. still swaddled in a soft gray towel, his eyes half open like someone waking to a new light after a long and troubled dream. Rowan stepped down and followed. He didn't speak, didn't ask questions. He simply walked beside them, his eyes tracing every movement, his hand still resting on Kaela's ear, like he had never let go. As they pushed through the door into the treatment wing, Eleanor glanced back one last time at the Elmridge backyard, a place that had once been a battleground and was now a field waiting for spring. And Rowan, on that early spring afternoon, held on to one thing only, the faint rhythm still pulsing beneath the ear of a dog, who had lived and protected as though every breath was a promise no one had the right to break. Inside the room was a wash and sterile white light with the gentle scent of antiseptic and the quiet hum of machines softer than Flynn's breathing. Rowan sat frozen on a plastic chair beside the examination table, his eyes fixed on the closed door across the room. 15 minutes had passed in silence. He didn't speak to his mother, didn't notice the people moving in and out. Every time the door creaked open and shut again, his heart skipped once. Quiet but heavy. Eleanor stood behind him, one hand placed gently on his shoulder. Her palm was warm, but it couldn't still the tiny tremors running through him. The sun had fully risen, casting a pale circle of light against the glass. Yet inside that room, time moved slow, like breath, held just a little too long. Then finally the door swung open. A woman in a blue scrub coat stepped out. Her hair was tied back, her eyes shadowed with exhaustion. She pulled down her mask, exhaled softly, and sat across from them. "Is the boy family to Kaela and Flinn?" The veterinarian asked, her gaze resting gently on Rowan. He nodded, then stood, straightening his back as if that posture might keep his heart from wavering. The doctor tilted her head slightly, her voice as soft as wind through dry grass. "They're both receiving fluids now. The situation is better than I expected, especially for Flynn." Rowan pressed his lips together, gripping the sleeve of his shirt tighter. "He has some bruising in the lungs. For a body that's small to withstand such pressure, it's a miracle. But if you'd come even 1 minute later, just 1 minute, he might not have been breathing at all." Eleanor placed a hand over her chest, her eyes brimming. But Rowan's gaze stayed on the doctor, dry-eyed yet frozen with something heavier than fear. "And Kaela?" he asked quietly. "We've stitched 8 wounds along her neck and 2 near her front leg," the doctor replied. "The skin was torn deeply from the python's fangs, and there's significant muscle trauma. But she never seized. She never fought us. No whimpers, no resistance. As if she knew exactly what needed to be done." Rowan felt a slow, steady knock inside his chest, something between awe and grief. The doctor paused, then added gently, "It's rare to see a mother dog in that state. So hurt and yet so aware. When I touched her wounds, she didn't flinch. Her eyes stayed on Flynn the entire time, even when her eyelids drooped and the blood wouldn't stop. That's the highest form of instinct I've ever witnessed." Eleanor reached for her son, gently pulling him close. But Rowan took a small step back. He raised his head and spoke slowly. "Can I go in to see her? Just for a little while?" The doctor nodded. Her eyes softened. The inpatient room was small, just a few metal beds and a narrow medicine counter. Kaela lay at the far end atop a dark fleece blanket. Beside her was Flynn, nestled in a portable warming pod, his head slightly tilted toward his mother, breathing softly like distant field whispers. Kaela hadn't opened her eyes, but her ears twitched faintly at the sound of approaching footsteps. Rowan walked slowly, as though afraid to shatter the fragile stillness wrapped around them. He sat beside the bed and gently tugged on her sleeve, a fur. "You gave everything, Kaela," he whispered. The doctor said, "If we were just a little later, Flynn might have..." His hand reached toward the white bandage wrapped around her neck. Beneath it were 8 stitches, silent, sharp. Like footnotes written into a page no one dared continue. Yet Kaela remained still breathing, though faintly. Her chest moved like ripples after a storm. Rowan placed his hand gently along her cheek, then shifted it to the place he'd always reached for on rainy nights, her ears. He didn't ask for anything. He didn't wait for a sign. He simply kept his hand there, warm, patient, and known. Rowan didn't cry. He didn't tremble. He simply sat still, gently stroking the remaining patch of fur around Kaela's ear. The one part untouched by blood, where the scent of earth, of wind, and of the back porch still lingered. Time in that room passed as though someone were holding each minute with care, refusing to let any one of them slip away unacknowledged. Eleanor stood just outside the door, gripping the canvas bag in her hands. There was a faint smile on her lips, not born of joy, but of quiet relief. She understood now some feelings didn't need to be spoken aloud. Some bonds could survive on a single glance, on a thread of stitching, and last forever. And Kaela, the brave mother dog, had kept a life from slipping away with nothing more than 8 stitches written into the fabric of blood. Night fell more slowly than usual. The sky above Elmridge stretched wide, painted in hues of indigo and lavender, like a blanket draped over hills, still bearing the raw scratches of morning. At the clinic, most lights were dimmed, save for a few soft glows flickering inside the recovery wing, like little embers guarding those who had just crossed back from the threshold of loss. Rowan lay curled on the cushioned bench beside Kaela's bed, knees drawn close, his head resting against a cotton pillow. There was no lullaby, no words to coax him to sleep. The exhaustion of body and soul had pulled him into a half-dreaming state, where time forgot to follow its rules. Beside him, Kaela lay curled in on herself. Her eyes remained shut, lids fluttering gently, as though ready to open the moment something changed. But her body was warm now, her wounds freshly bandaged, her breath still labored, but steady. The doctor had said she was responding well. Recovery would be slow, but possible. Flinn had already fallen into a deep sleep, tucked in a soft towel nest, placed snug against his mother's chest, close enough to feel her heartbeat, no matter how faint. Sometime later, Rowan stirred slightly. Without opening his eyes, his hand reached out instinctively, searching for the familiar. And as if their minds still moved in rhythm, Kaela lifted her head and gently rested it against his leg. Her stitched muzzle touched his knee like a silent request for permission to be near. No one spoke. No sound was needed. There was only a quiet warmth moving beneath the skin, something that made Rowan stop flinching at the memories from that morning. Outside, the curtain rustled softly in the window breeze. Somewhere in the distance, insects sang, low, rhythmic, like the lullaby of the forest for those returning from pain. Eleanor had chosen to sleep in the room next door on a fold-out cot. She wanted Rowan and Kaela to have this night together, a decision no one questioned. She knew some bonds couldn't be reasoned with. They were forged in the countless dawns of early risings, in the wait beneath the porch light for headlights to return, and in the gentle lick of a dog that once meant good night. That night, Rowan didn't have nightmares. He slept with his legs still slightly extended, just enough for Kaela's head to rest there. His hand would twitch now and then, not from discomfort, but as if to check silently that his friend was still with him. Kaela, for her part, never fully drifted off. Her eyes were closed, but every time the door creaked, her ears would shift, her neck would tilt. It wasn't fear. It was instinct. She couldn't rise anymore. But that one position, head resting on the boy's leg, was the only place she trusted as safe. The clinic had never known a night so still. A staff member passing through the hallway paused briefly by their door. Through the narrow slit of light, they glimpsed a quiet scene. A boy sleeping, his pale cheek illuminated by golden light, and a large dog, scarred, stitched, resting her head upon him, eyes half closed but calm. The nurse said nothing. They quietly closed the door so the light would not disturb the healing taking place within. Perhaps for the first time in many days, Rowan understood what it felt like to sleep without curling inward, without yanking the blanket close, without shivering from dread. He let himself drift in sync with Kaela's breath, one beat at a time, slow but certain. And Kaela, in her light-drenched slumber, knew too, the fiercest battle of her life had passed. She no longer needed to thrash through darkness. She was allowed now to place her head against the life she had protected, quietly, fully. Near midnight, the wind shifted. It no longer carried the damp chill of mist, but a gentle coolness that swept through the pine trees by the window. The sky had cleared completely, stars burning above like distant eyes, watching over a rooftop where one boy and one dog finally slept in peace. And though no one heard it, there seemed to be a murmur echoing from the woods outside, soft as breath. "Tonight you may rest, and I will keep watch." By late afternoon, Elmridge was bathed in sunlight, the color of honey, trickling slowly through the leaves overhead. The air still carried a slight bite of early spring, but the fields behind the clinic were alive with birds returning their calls, rustling the grass like melodies long forgotten. Rowan sat beneath the willow tree out front, a small cloth pouch in his lap. He worked quietly with scraps of leather needle and thread and a handful of smooth, round wooden beads. His hands were clumsy but careful. Every stitch was deliberate, as if each one was a thank you he couldn't yet form into words. Not far away, Kaela lay on a bed of grass beneath the wooden awning. The stitches across her neck had begun to heal, and new fur was starting to grow around the scars. She no longer dragged herself from place to place. Now she could lie comfortably, breathe deeply, and lift her head when the wind changed. Flinn slept soundly in Eleanor's lap, his little belly rising and falling in rhythm. He was stronger now, though he still preferred to burrow against warmth, guided by instincts not yet worn away. Rowan tied another knot, then gently pulled the thread taut. He tested the loop of leather around his wrist for size. After a few small adjustments, he clipped the final thread, and slid the last bead into place. The collar had no metal clasp, no modern fittings, just a soft brown strip, cut from his father's old belt, cleaned and polished. Along its length, Rowan had placed 4 wooden beads, each one for a pup. And in the center, a slightly larger bead carved with care using his small pocket knife. Etched into the smooth face of the wooden bead, hesitant yet clear, was a short line of words, "Guardian of the Young." Rowan approached Kaela. She lifted her head slightly, tilting it in that familiar way, as if to ask what he had brought this time. He knelt before her, holding out the collar with both hands. His eyes were bright, and he didn't need to say a word. Kaela looked at the collar, then looked at him. There was no bark, no licking, no wagging. Only a silence that both of them understood. Rowan reached under her chin and gently removed the old collar, worn and faded, the one she had worn since she was a pup, and replaced it with the new one, fastening it just right. The wooden bead touched the fur on her chest, warm, like Rowan's hand every time he stroked her. This wasn't about control. It wasn't for a leash or to hang a tag. This collar was a reminder, for her and for him, that Kaela wasn't just a mother dog. She was the living boundary between life and loss, between safety and chaos, between peace and panic. She was the guardian of the border. Through a howl carried by the wind, through paw prints pressed into wet earth, through a gaze that never wavered from her young, and through the blood that still marked her neck. Eleanor stepped out from the house, caught sight of the moment, and smiled softly before stepping back in. She didn't want to interrupt something sacred, a boy offering reverence to a creature who never needed words to teach loyalty. Kaela lowered her head, her chin resting gently on Rowan's hand. The wooden bead gave a soft clack as it shifted. "This collar is so—" "You remember," Rowan whispered, his hand still on her back. "No matter what happens, you're always the one who runs first." Kaela closed her eyes. Her breath deepened as if she accepted the gesture, not as a reward, but as a promise honored. The late day wind swept through the fields, carrying the scent of newly opened wildflowers. The final spots of sunlight danced across the ground, sketching soft golden circles around the two figures, boy and dog, resting on the edge between silence and renewal. And there, in that moment, there was no tension, no noise. Only the gentleness of being remembered, for protecting. Summer came sooner than expected. The sunlight in Elmridge fell across the fields like a golden net cast wide, making each blade of grass shimmer as if wrapped in light. On the wooden porch, the sound of footsteps grew stronger, steadier. It was Flinn. Now nearly as tall as his mother, he still kept the same habit, walking slowly out the door, always pausing for a few seconds before stepping past the threshold. Each time Kaela watched from a distance, her brown eyes calm deep like a lake that never rippled. She didn't follow his every step anymore. But she didn't need to. One glance, and she knew exactly what Flinn was thinking. Flinn had grown. The once scruffy coat of gray and cream had smoothed into a fine sheen. His shoulders had squared, his stance no longer clumsy. But one thing on his body had never faded. A faint line curving across his left chest. It wasn't swollen or sore, just a patch where the fur grew in a different direction, forming a subtle arc, as if someone had once drawn it with the tip of a finger. That was where the coil had started. Every evening, Rowan would gently stroke that spot. When Flinn lay beside him, head on his lap, ears relaxed, as if listening to an old story. Flinn no longer remembered the pain, but his senses remained sharp to anything that slithered close to the ground. That day, Rowan was sketching a layout of the backyard, planning to plant new lavender bushes. Flinn sat a few steps away, eyes tracking the newly planted stakes. Suddenly, his ears twitched, and he leapt forward toward the edge of the garden. Kaela tensed, but didn't move. She watched him, not with worry, but as if to see what he had learned from the early years. Flinn gave a single sharp growl, a warning brief and certain. Rowan dashed toward him and froze at the sight before him. Flinn standing between him and a half-meter-long water snake weaving through the row of unprotected plants. The young dog's face was tight, front legs lowered, braced for impact. But what struck Rowan wasn't the bravery. It was the look in Flynn's eyes. Wide, yes, but with a flicker of uncertainty deep inside. There was fear, not overwhelming, just lingering, like a memory of pressure still hiding somewhere in his breath. And yet Flinn stood firm. The snake paused, lifted its head, then turned away, slipping back into the grass and vanishing. Only when he was sure the threat had passed did Flinn lower his body. Rowan stepped closer, knelt beside him, and placed his hand on the faint scar over Flynn's heart. "You still remember," he whispered. Flinn gave his hand a gentle lick, then sat back down as if nothing serious had happened. The story spread through the little valley over the following days. Neighbors came by, shook Rowan's hand, patted Flynn's head, and sat sipping coffee with Eleanor on the porch. Everyone praised the young dog's quick reflexes. But to Rowan's family, the greater truth was this: Flinn had overcome his own fear to protect what he loved. And that was the real courage. From her resting spot beneath the old apple tree, Kaela watched like an old leader watching the next generation. And perhaps in that moment, she exhaled a quiet breath of relief. Not because Flinn was safe, but because he had grown strong enough that the past no longer held him tight. The next day, Rowan brought out a small wooden board. He added 2 simple legs and planted it into the ground beside the barn entrance, right where Flinn stood guard each morning. On it, in uneven but clear white paint, he wrote, "Once there was a coil. Now there is a guardian." Flinn approached, sat in front of the sign, head tilted slightly, as if trying to grasp the deeper meaning within each word. Rowan looked at him and smiled. "Even scared, you stayed, and that's enough." The wind brushed past the two of them. A beam of afternoon sunlight landed squarely on the faint line across Flynn's chest, not hiding it, not highlighting it, just letting it be, a part of his body, like his heart, like his memory, quiet but unbreakable. And in the heart of Elmridge Valley, a dog who once came close to vanishing was slowly becoming the one who watched over the little ones, with a gentleness born from the very scar that once nearly ended him. The wind in Elmridge had changed. It was still gentle at sunrise, threading between the chirping birds and the soft light pouring over the porch planks. But in this season, it sometimes swept across the open fields, with a deeper hum, shaking the old eucalyptus trees until their branches swayed as if trying to speak. Once wind had unsettled Rowan. To him, it was a reminder of chaos, of moments that spun out of control of the day. Flinn had nearly vanished. But now, whenever the wind pushed through the trees, he instinctively glanced toward the newly rebuilt kennel behind the house. It was Eleanor who had suggested fencing the area with tall wood and steel mesh, not only to protect the puppies still learning to stand, but also to give Kaela and Flinn a quiet space to rest without worry. They had picked the windiest day of the week to begin repairs, as if meeting old fears head-on by building something new from their place. Rowan rolled metal sheets to the back hammer, tapping steadily. Hector stopped by with cut planks. A gift from an old man with too much time and too many thoughts, he'd said. He spoke little, only nodding and steadying a post now and then, lifting Rowan's elbow when the boy climbed up to drive nails higher. Kaela lay near the edge of the porch, head resting on her front paws. The fur along her left flank, once matted and bruised, had grown back in patchy silver like a quiet kind of armor. Her rear right leg still stiffened when standing too long, but it never kept her from moving. Every step Kaela took was slower now, but certain. She followed Eleanor's sweeping without a sound, a silent shadow in the early light. Most afternoons, Rowan brought Kaela and Flinn out to the field. They traced the same trails he once used to sneak Flinn out to play, the same places where howls used to break the silence like alarms. But now, even in the wind, everything felt calmer. One afternoon, a particularly harsh gust rattled the kennel door so loud that Eleanor nearly told Rowan to stop hammering. But he raised his hand gently. "Let's finish it today," he said, "so the next wind has nothing to shake." Kaela stood nearby, ears tilted to the whistle in the grass. Flinn circled the new fence line, tagging each corner like he was redrawing the boundary of safety. He didn't react to every noise anymore, but tall grass still made him cautious. When Rowan fastened the new latch on the kennel gate and connected the fence to the house wall, he turned to Kaela. She stepped slowly forward, sniffing the frame, testing the welds, the hinges, the smell of fresh lumber. Then she sat down. It was a quiet nod of approval. That evening, Eleanor served roasted cornbread roots and ginger tea on the outdoor table. Steam tilted sideways in the wind. They sat in a small circle, eyes resting on the finished fence, and beyond the fields beginning to glow green under spring's touch. "Looks like rain tomorrow," Eleanor said, but her voice was calm. "First time the winds come back, and I don't feel afraid." Rowan nodded. "Because now we've got Wall's warning signs. And them." He motioned toward the two figures sitting at the path's end, Flinn and Kaela, the mother and son flanking the entrance from either side, ears upright, eyes scanning ahead, not with tension, but awareness. Not alertness from fear, but readiness from peace. Hector lifted his teacup, smiled faintly. The wind only frightens those unprepared. Once you've lived through it, really lived through it, then it just becomes a whisper. A reminder of the day someone walked into it and came back alive. Kaela didn't know what his words meant, but she looked up, just as another gust caught the strip of cloth tied to the kennel post. It fluttered in the fading sun, a flag Rowan had torn from an old shirt, a quiet marker for a place that had once known violence, and now knew victory. Kaela rose and walked slowly to the entrance. She paused at the wooden step, one leg unsure, then placed her weight down firm and steady. Each step now spoke one truth: the wind may howl, but this ground was solid. And so the next season of storms wouldn't arrive as something to fear, but something to meet with calm. The evening settled over Elmridge like amber silk. Leaves flickered, gently casting broken patches of light onto the porch where Rowan sat back against the post, eyes half closed. Flinn curled in his lap, belly rising in slow, even rhythm. His head rested on Rowan's sleeve legs, tucked in a sleep full of trust. The faint scar across his chest caught a sliver of sunlight, like a memory gently drawn on skin. Kaela lay beside them, paws stretched out, her head tilted toward the boy and his pup. She faced them naturally, protectively, even with her eyes closed. Together they gazed past the yard beyond the fence into the forest's edge, where sunlight still played in the grass. Somewhere past those trees was the place it all began, where one fragile life had nearly been lost, where soft fur once soaked in blood, where a mother had fought with teeth and bone and breath. But now, no one stared back with fear. They simply existed together as wind slipped past like nature's lullaby. Rowan reached over, gently placed a hand on Flynn's head. From neck to shoulder, he traced down to the collar he'd once sewn himself. The letters, Flynn, had faded. He had no plans to replace it, because every worn thread, every fray held the story of how they'd grown up together. Kaela stirred slightly. She wasn't dreaming, just adjusting to the soft post-rain breeze. Her ears rose and fell to the beat of crickets rustling grass and the calm pulse of those beside her. There was no signal, no alarm, just the quiet of a day that didn't ask for anything more. Across the yard behind the fence, the other puppies chased each other in the gold light. One tumbled, another tripped, but they got up again quickly. The ground of Elmridge was soft enough for every fall. Wind moved again, not loud, just enough to graze Rowan's shirt. Flynn sighed in his sleep, shifting closer to the boy. From the kitchen, Eleanor's voice carried through the dusk. "Rowan, it's getting late. Time for dinner." He answered softly, "Okay." But he didn't stand, because some moments are meant to be sat through, to feel life unfolding in stillness. Minutes later, Hector passed the fence carrying a basket of apples. He saw the scene on the porch, then quietly set the basket down and stepped back without a word. Behind them, the forest waved its leaves toward the wind. On the other side had once been chaos. Now there was only the steady heartbeat of a home, a family, and a bond that no words were ever needed to explain. Kaela opened her eyes. She looked at Rowan and Flynn. Maybe she too was remembering, not in images, but in instinct. The way Flynn once fit into her body. The way Rowan once shook with fear, yet never dropped the shovel. The way both had stayed, when they could have run. And from that choice, something miraculous had begun. Not through luck, but through love. Rowan bent down, whispered something too quiet to hear. The wind carried it past the eaves, past the trees, to a place where old stories lay buried or reborn. Kaela closed her eyes. Flynn slept on. And life, quiet, steady, and warm, continued in the breath of a mother who never left her post. In a world that often feels too fast, too loud, and too cruel, there are stories like this one, tucked away in places like Elmridge, that echo far beyond their quiet beginnings. The story of Kaela, Flinn, and a boy named Rowan is more than survival. It's about a bond that was never taught, only lived. A bond of trust, of sacrifice, and of unconditional love. The German Shepherd has long been revered for intelligence, loyalty, and bravery. But through Kaela, we see something even greater. A mother's love so deep it bled and healed in silence. A dog who stood between death and her child, not because she was trained to, but because her heart told her to. Flinn, marked by a scar and a memory, grew up knowing that protection came not from commands, but from presence. Rowan, who held the shovel, who stayed, carries that story in every fiber of who he becomes. A quiet kind of heroism, born from simply refusing to look away. Love doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it walks on four legs, rests its head on your knee, and waits patiently for the wind to calm. To love animals isn't about grand gestures. It begins with listening, with honoring the silent loyalty of a creature who has already chosen to protect you, long before you knew you needed it. And sometimes in the stillness, that love becomes the very thing that holds the world together.